Amy Goodman is here. She is a journalist. She is the host of Democracy Now!, a radio program broadcasting on the Pacifica Radio Network. The show has become an important outlet for those in opposition to a possible war with Iraq. This month, it will expand to 2 hours in order to accommodate more reporting on the war if it comes. Goodman has received the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, the George Polk Award, and the Overseas Press Club Award. I'm pleased to have her here at this table for the first time. Welcome.
It's good to be with you, Charlie.
First thing I should say, it's also on television.
Yes, we are now the largest public media collaboration in the country. We're broadcasting on Pacifica Radio, community radio stations, NPR stations around the country, and also on satellite television, on Free Speech TV, and on public access TV stations around the country.
Get that, America?
And the reason I say that is just because we need public media now.
Of course.
In a time of war. We need independent reporting.
Well, I don't know what independent means. Independent in contrast to what?
It means not being sponsored by the corporations, the networks like NBC, CBS, ABC, NBC owned by General Electric, or CBS owned by Viacom, or Disney's ABC.
Just as a moment of my point would be in response to that is that we do need you. Because you bring a quality of reporting and a quality of broadcasting, and more people ought to have access to the media, and there ought to be more voices reporting. Having said that, I promise you, CBS News and ABC News and NBC News are not influenced by the corporations that may own those companies, since I know one of them very well and work for one of them. Tell me about what's going on as you see it in the country in opposition to the war.
There is a powerful force, not only in this country, in the United States, but around the world. On February 15th, 30 million people, the world, gave a global response to war, and they said no. Tens of thousands of people marched, hundreds of thousands, millions. In New York alone, around 500,000 people. This is unprecedented. You've got one force that is George Bush, representing the most powerful arsenal on earth. And then you've got another force, and it is the voice of the people, not their so-called leaders, but the people around the world.
When they're being heard, what is it you think, what assumption you think the White House is making, having listened to the President's press conference, having listened to the voices of protest, having read and thought about this yourself? What assumptions do you think the White House is making, or the administration is making, that are wrong?
I don't really know what the administration thinks, but I have a pretty good sense of what people in this country. I mean, the majority of people are opposed to war. I think George Bush is making a very serious miscalculation, thinking that he can side with basically those that brought him to power, which is certainly not the majority of people in this country, as we know from the election 2000. He was selected. He was not elected. And what he has done is he has tried to basically say that he's got the power, right? He represents the most powerful country on earth. It's true, but the people represent something more powerful. And there is corporate globalization that he represents, but there's grassroots globalization. And one thing George Bush has succeeded in doing is uniting people around the world against him.
What is it you think, back to my point, is that they're simply against war, or are they against war against Saddam Hussein, or are they against the United States, period?
I think people in this country and around the world are against a U.S. invasion of Iraq. The media will sometimes show a picture of a target on Saddam Hussein's forehead. I think it would be much more accurate to show a target on the forehead of a little Iraqi girl, because that's who dies in war. The majority of people who die in war are innocent civilians. And there are people all over this country in those protests that are holding signs that say things like, how many lives per gallon, and no blood for oil. They don't think that that little Iraqi girl should die for their gas tank. Another thing, I often refer to the Bush administration as the oiligarchy. Look at who we have there. We have George Bush, who was an oil man. You have Dick Cheney, the vice president, former head of the largest oil services corporation in the world. You have Condoleezza Rice. She had a Chevron oil tanker named after her, the Condoleezza Rice. And they represent a force that people are beginning to very clearly understand, and they're saying no to it.
But as soon as you say that, I don't have to tell you this, but you know this. I mean, Condoleezza Rice came to her position having been provost at Stanford University, one of the great universities in this country, elected by not oil men, but elected by faculty and board of trustees there.
Condoleezza Rice was on the board of Chevron, the largest oil company headquartered in California. But it's not just Condoleezza Rice. It is a group in Washington, D.C., in the government, that I think very much have lost touch with the American people. We have not seen the level of protest in this country in many, many years. This is far greater than we saw before the Vietnam War. And I really do think the most important message right now is that war is not inevitable.
Certain questions I want to raise, because what I'd love to hear from you, and I am hearing from you, is a sense of how you sit there at that microphone and hear this protest against the war, and exactly how you see it, and what distinctions do the people make. Clearly, there's no one who's protesting this war who looks with favor upon Saddam Hussein, because he has done violence and has killed men, women, and children in atrocious means, correct? So everybody's opposed to Saddam Hussein.
Unfortunately, not everyone. Ask Donald Rumsfeld. He should be asked here this question. Here we have the defense secretary who in 1983 and 1984 went to Baghdad, shook hands with Saddam Hussein at a time when both the State Department and the United Nations had come out with reports saying he had used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers. There was Donald Rumsfeld as President Reagan's envoy, sent there to normalize relations with Saddam Hussein. So I think he needs to be asked why he served as the point man to normalize relations, to allow for U.S. companies to sell all sorts of support to Saddam Hussein. We have to look at that history and understand how Saddam Hussein was shored up, this dictator, all of these years.
Well, and supported in the war against Iran that he launched.
We're talking about terror. Right now, we're talking about use of chemical and biological weapons. Where did he get these? There is a joke, which unfortunately is not a joke, that's going around, which is the reason the U.S. knows he has various components for weapons is because the U.S. government has got the receipts. It is very important to point out that they knew he was using this at the time. And by the way, the U.S. not only normalized relations with Saddam Hussein, but they also provided the coordinates, the intelligence for him to gas Iranian soldiers. Back
to Saddam Hussein and intent. I mean, if you listen to the president's press conference, he said the following things. He said, I believe that Saddam Hussein is a threat to the national security of the United States. I'm president. I'm sworn to uphold and defend the national security of the United States, and I believe that is my constitutional responsibility, and I believe that Saddam Hussein may be acquiring weapons of mass destruction or have them, and that he may, as he has used them against his own people, may, in fact, be in some kind of alliance in the future with terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda. Does any of that bother you?
The Bush administration has not proven its case at all. In fact, its own intelligence agencies, like the CIA, have said a number of things. Yes, I am concerned about national security in this country. George Tenet, when testifying before the Senate a few weeks ago, said that a new nuclear arms race is being launched among small nations. I think that is connected to Donald Rumsfeld saying he will not rule out a preemptive nuclear attack. This is very frightening. If countries think that they cannot defend themselves, they will arm themselves. And I'm afraid that we in the United States are at the root of this new nuclear arms race. This is very threatening to us. Another thing, George Bush, in his, couldn't even quite call it a press conference, but In that event last week, he said at the beginning of his talk, because really that's what it was, with a few questions asked by reporters, but he basically just made a few points and did not respond to most of the questions. He said at the beginning, could you imagine Saddam Hussein is bugging the weapons inspectors, etc. I think there is an important story that is hardly getting picked up in this country. It was put out by the Observer of London, and it is about a top-secret national security agency, NSA memo, that went to both the British intelligence and U.S. intelligence talking about the bugging of UN Security Council diplomats, specifically the middle six countries, Chile, Pakistan, as well as Angola and Cameroon and Guinea, to bug their home phones as well as their office phones, their emails, their faxes, to see what they're thinking, to try to sway them. I don't think this represents a democracy. I know that the Chilean delegation behind the scenes is absolutely outraged, knowing well what it meant to live under the Augusto Pinochet dictatorship. I think we have to ask very serious questions about the means that the U.S. government is getting to try to get support for this war. I think the greater threat to national security is this push for an invasion of Iraq. Even the CIA says that Saddam Hussein is not likely to attack unless he is attacked first. This is what is the great threat to national security, is a preemptive strike against Iraq. George Bush is engaged right now in a kind of global sniper politics. What was so scary about the snipers? We didn't know where they'd strike next. And that's what countries see around the world. You've got Afghanistan. We then hit Yemen with a missile. I didn't know we had declared war on Yemen. Then it is Iraq.
But before you go on that, let me just ask, were you opposed to the military action that took place in Afghanistan as a response to 9/11 and what happened there in terms of the attack on Afghanistan and kicking out the Taliban?
Yes, I don't think that the killing of innocent civilians is the answer. After 9/11, you had journalists on television saying 90% of Americans are for war. I never believed it. What was the question people were asked? If they were asked, do you believe the killing of innocent civilians should be avenged by the killing of innocent civilians, more than 90% of Americans would say no. Americans are a compassionate people. I think the level of resistance to war and what George Bush is engaged in now is tremendous in this country. And an untold part of the story is the level of resistance within the military as well. I was just out at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, where thousands were protesting a Bush invasion of Iraq. They talked about
thousands of citizens from
thousands
Kirtland.
of citizens in Albuquerque, New Mexico, outside this Air Force Base. And they talked about the vigil they kept there and how one day they were standing with their signs, and a military man went by into the base and he rolled down his window and he said, "Hang in there." Years ago, I went on the Sally Jesse Raphael show during the Persian Gulf War. She had 6 women, 3 for, 3 against the war. And after I left that program and it aired, the most interesting response I got was from women on southern military bases who called up and said, "We agree with you." And they said they can't have these debates on military bases, but they rely on us and civilian society to have these debates. And we need the mainstream media to be there, to provide a forum in a democratic society for a debate. And unfortunately in this country, I have to disagree with you, Charlie, respectfully, on the issue of NBC, CBS, and ABC. They have provided a very serious disservice to the people of this country when it comes to a true debate around war. Most people are opposed to war, yet the vast majority of guests across the board on the networks are for war. They're a parade of retired generals and
what I was trying to, the point, you can make that argument and look at it, and that's not the point I was taking. The point I was making is it's not dictated by whoever the corporate ownership is. I promise you that.
Well, I could only say...
they're not dictating. They're not saying, we want you to have more generals who are in favor of the war than you have generals who are in opposition to the war. That's just not
Well, they don't have to
the way
say
it
that.
works.
They just hire the people who will do just that.
Well, I mean the people, the argument I have maybe with respect, is that Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather, a whole range of people, are journalists who have paid their dues, and they're very competent journalists who are reporting for news magazines and for those broadcasts. as soon as I say that, I say how important it is, I think, that what you do and others, have an opportunity to be part of the debate.
I can only say that during the Persian Gulf War, what we saw on NBC and CBS, NBC owned by General Electric, at the time CBS was owned by Westinghouse, two of the major nuclear weapons manufacturers in the world. I don't think it was any accident that what we saw on TV was a military hardware show.
Dan Rather was working at CBS before Westinghouse even became a partner, bought CBS.
It's not about just one person.
Well, but you're suggesting that because they choose the people. I'm just saying that this is a debate for another time, which I'm happy to have them come and talk about that. But
well, let me quote Dan Rather himself on BBC. He said he thinks he would be necklaced. He thinks that he cannot simply speak out and ask the kinds of questions that should be asked. That's quoting Dan Rather.
I'm surprised to hear that, and don't doubt that he said it, don't know that he said it, but don't, I'm not quarreling with your source. I'm surprised, since he and I are colleagues at 60 Minutes too, that he doesn't, I just don't believe it, that is his opinion, that he can't ask anything he wants to. I think he felt like he could ask anything of Saddam Hussein he wanted to, and he said to me he chose the questions he wanted to ask.
Well, overall, I would just challenge...
Not dictated by anybody in New York.
Well, I would just challenge the mainstream media to open up the ranks, to provide a forum for the full diversity of voices that represent this country and people around the world.
That's a perfectly good idea. I don't have any argument with that idea. I mean, I do have an argument with sort of with what you have said about who they listen to in terms of their reporting, because I have such respect for the people who are going to the battlefields and reporting from New York in terms of their own integrity. It is wrong to impugn their integrity.
Well, I was just quoting Dan Rather.
Okay. Congratulations for the work you do. Thank you for coming. Will you come back?
I'd be honored.
Thank you. Amy Goodman, Pacifica Radio. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.